Hello, folks. Welcome. I am again Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs of Atid, the Web Yeshiva, and the Agnon House. This is the third of our three sessions on Agnon and Rabbi Nachman, and I really struggled to choose what it is that we should do, because the truth is we could have had 10 or 12 or 20 sessions, and we still wouldn't have exhausted all there is to say. For example, we didn't talk about the connection between Rabbi Nachman and Kafka's Metamorphosis and Woody Allen's Annie Hall. It's not so PC to talk about Woody Allen anymore, but what can you do? It's a good joke. Agnon's Sipur Pashut, a simple story, which we had I think last year we had a few sessions exploring that novel. Is also draws material from Rabbi Nachman, particularly his very famous Tales of Madness, of going insane. And we'll touch a little bit on madness and insanity tonight. But there's just so many more things to be said. There's so many other points of interaction. And if you don't know which Woody Allen joke I'm referring to, so replay the final scene of Annie Hall. You can get it on YouTube. The punchline is, "But we need the eggs." Man goes to the doctor, says, "Doctor, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken." The doctor says, "Well, bring him in right away. We'll treat him." The man says, "We would, except we need the eggs." That's an iteration of the very famous Rabbi Nachman story about the turkey prince, the chicken prince, about the prince who thinks that he's the son of the king. You don't need to be a great literary scholar to unpack what the symbol might be here. In other words, who's a king and who's the son of a king? No? Who's the king? Melech Malchei Amlochim, the king of kings. Who's the son of the king? Who's the prince? The Jewish people. So the prince goes Meshuggah. He thinks he's a chicken or a rooster. And he takes off his clothing and he's under the table, under the royal table, pecking around at the dirt for bugs. The king calls all his wise men and says, heal him. And none of the wise men can do anything until one wise man comes and says, "Well, I think I can try to help." And the wise man also takes off all of his clothing and gets down under the table and starts going, cock-a-doodle-doo, and pecking at the worms. And the prince says to him, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm also a chicken." There's that Jerusalem syndrome. There are people that think that they're either, if they're Christian, not Mashiach so much. They think that if they're Christians come to Yerushalayim and think they're Jesus, and Jews think that they're King David. And there have been fights in the mental wards. You think you're King David? I'm King David. So you remember that fellow that used to hang out at the Kotel? Dressed in he had a nevel, he had a harp, and he dressed in biblical clothing with a crown. And everybody thought it was like a street theater. Like it was a way that he collected. No, but in fact, the poor fellow actually did indeed think he was David Melech Yisrael, Chai V'Kayam, and he met a bad end. He unfortunately turned up dead a few years ago in the Jerusalem forest. It's a sad story, but the story resonates here because people didn't realize that he was crazy. Right? Who's to tell who's crazy and who's not crazy in a world where everything is upside down? So the advisor gets under the table and says, "I'm also a chicken." And he says to the prince, "Just because we're chickens, does that mean that we can't wear pants?" The prince says, "Maybe a chicken can wear pants." So he signals, and they throw down some pants, and they put on pants. And they're clucking around, eating more worms, and this is a Rebbe Nachman story. And he says, "You think just because we're chickens we can't wear a shirt?" So they put on a shirt. "You think just because we're chickens we can't eat normal food?" So they throw down some sandwiches or something. And he says, "You think just because we're chicken we have to stand at the table? Maybe we can sit at the table like those people?" He says, "Yeah, maybe we could do that." So he slowly brings them out of it until they're sitting at the table, dressed like human beings, eating human food, right? But the prince knows that he's still a chicken, right? In other words, it's what is insanity? Rabbi Nachman is looking at a generation who's, in his mind, has gone insane. Because the mark of insanity is that they have distanced themselves from their father, the king. Rabbi Nachman views secularism, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, the simple abandonment of the world of tradition as a mark of insanity. Rabbi Agnon uses these themes in his Sipur Pashut, as does ultimately Woody Allen himself. Tonight we're going to look at the story Hashir Asher Hushar, the song which was sung, which you have available to you in my translation. You know, the problem with translating a story and then teaching it is that you're forced to wrestle with the text in a way that you didn't have to. Teaching a text, it requires much more intimacy than translating a text. So when you teach it, you then have to, or you prepare to teach it, you then have to wrestle with every word you chose. And say, oh, why did I translate it this way? I should translate it that way. The nuance is lost here. I could have done this. I could have done that. But I suffered these indignities in order to be able to come and teach you. So I hope you're appreciative of that. Hashir Asher Ushar is one of the 20 stories in the Sefer HaMa'asim, this collection. And again, clearly the title Sefer HaMa'asim, the book of, usually it's translated as the book of deeds, although you can deliberate whether that's the accurate translation for this collection. The Sefer HaMa'asim are these 20 short stories, these surrealistic tales, the stories for which Agnon was compared to Kafka, a comparison to which he bristled at, as I explained in detail when we met 2 weeks ago. Surrealism, this movement that kind of springs up in the 1920s and 30s. And it's so interesting because you see it everywhere. This is, of course, perhaps the most famous surrealistic painting. It's Dali's The Persistence of Memory from 1931. Agnon starts publishing the Sefer HaMa'asim. The first stories in that collection are published in May of 1932. Dali himself, of course, I mentioned this, and I didn't have the photo available. Here's Dali himself. He almost looks like as if he walked out of a surrealistic painting himself. The story that we're looking at is one of the later additions to this collection, the Sefer HaMa'asim. All of these stories are marked by this kind of nightmarish feel, the sense of the world is not exactly as it seems. This particular story, maybe a little less than some of the other classic exemplars. This particular story is really quite short, but nevertheless, there is still something surreal. It doesn't exactly match up with the way the world works as we know it, as I will get to momentarily. This story was originally published at the beginning of October 1940 in the Haaretz newspaper. Then it was lightly revised for when it was collected in the book form in the first edition, which came out in 1942. I should just mention, by way of crediting the sources from which I draw, there's not that much written on this particular. There's some stories that there's mountain of commentary on. And there are other stories that there's very little written on this story, but the researcher, Professor Tzvi Mark, who lives out by us in Efrat, who really is the undisputed figure in Cheker Breslov, the research as an academic field of Breslov Hasidut, wrote a little article on this story in which he excavates many of the sources in Breslov. That article is available in Hebrew online at the website of the journal Ayin Gimel. There was a short-lived electronic journal of Agnon's study that was published at Bar Ilan, and you can find the article, and if you can't find it on your own, I'm happy to send it to you. But the article is in Hebrew, so I just want to credit Tzvi Mark for this and for all of his other research, of course, on Breslov, which is so important. As opposed to what we've done last weekend, partially the week before, where we took an Agnon story and a Nachman story and showed the connections. Here we're just going to be looking at Agnon, but then we'll be going to the outside to see the Nachman sources, the Breslov sources on which he is drawing. The story begins. It's here in this English collection, The Outcast and Other Tales. Unfortunately, a few people bought copies of the book. This is the book that contains the story we looked at last week, The Outcast, Hanidach, as well as this particular story, as well as about half of the other surrealistic stories from the Sefer HaMa'asim, but they've restocked if anybody wants to purchase a copy here, and the folks online, you can, of course, get it at Amazon. The story begins... People had a chance to read it before? Yes? Okay. That sweet man returned and arrived. His smile shined on his lips and brightened the dusk in his beard. That smile, which never left his mouth, gave him an equitable demeanor. Yet his simple piety heartened his movements and touched my heart. He was thin and threadbare clothes. He was thin with threadbare clothes, like the poor who lack the means to buy new clothing. In all cases, they were neither torn nor soiled nor patched. He carried a hunchback of a bundle, like one undisturbed by the burden placed on him. The narrator of all of the stories of the Sefer HaMa'asim, the narrator we're meant to imagine is Agnon himself, a middle-aged man entrenched within Jewish tradition, living at home with a wife and 2 children in a house in this neighborhood on this street, perhaps exactly on the plot of land that we're sitting. But I mentioned that in order to distinguish between the narrator that he creates that looks a lot like him and the autobiographical author who's writing the story. Now, this sweet man that he describes was well understood to be an actual historical figure, and Agnon admitted this. He didn't always do this. Agnon didn't always, kind of give you the keys to decode a story or something that he wrote. But he admitted that this unnamed sweet man in the story was none other than Rav Meir Anshin, Rav Shmuel Meir Anshin. He was called Meir Anshin. He was also called Rav Meir Zhinkover, because he came from a place called Zhinkov. He was born in 1880. He came on Aliyah around 1910. And he was a Breslover Chassid here in Yerushalayim in a time when, to be a Breslov, I mentioned when we first met 2 weeks ago, the contemporary manifestation of Breslov, these fellows at the intersections with the trucks and the music and the bouncing up and down and the white yarmulkes and the Nachman, that is a contemporary iteration that doesn't go back earlier than the late 70s, early 80s. But there was a community, a small community of Breslover Hasidim here in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Meir was a figure within that community. And the description, what we know of his actual biography, matches up completely with the description here. He was rather poor. He was very humble. He was a bookseller. Agnon, those of you that visited with us last week up in the library, and those of you online are welcome to come and visit us in Jerusalem so you can see it yourselves. Agnon has this extremely rich library with volumes that are both contemporary and antique. The oldest book we have in the library is from the mid-16th century, the Sefer Ikarim of Yosef Albo. Agnon was an inveterate book collector. Part of his responsibility in his relationship with Shokin, his patron, Shokin, of course, built up perhaps the most impressive private library of Judaica, among the most impressive, and that became the kernel of the JTS library. In the United States, the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan has the most impressive collection of Judaica and manuscripts and etc., and a lot of that came from Shokin. And one of Agnon's responsibilities, there were many people that did this for Shokin, was to be a book collector. He had a kind of, I don't know exactly how the finances work. Today, he would have had a credit card that he could have used to charge things on Shokin's account if there were books that he found noteworthy. Because in the 19-teens and 20s, and then even more so after the Shoah in the early years of the state, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, those of you that came to Yerushalayim, anybody here since the 50s? But there are people here certainly from the 60s, or there are people that remember having visited here in the 60s, yes? right? So once upon a time, Jerusalem was the mecca of secondhand bookstores. Every street corner had a secondhand bookstore. And today there are very few left. I actually took my students before they went back to America after their year of study. I took them on a kind of tour of like the notable secondhand bookstores in Jerusalem, just because these places need to be preserved. If we give it all over to these, the Tomet Sfarim, it'll lose all the neshama. Besides the fact you can't find certain books in these, shopping mall bookstores. What happened? Agnon describes this in a few stories. Old Yidden came to Yerushalayim with their libraries from Europe, and either they had to sell them off in order to support themselves, or when they died, maybe their children were a little further removed from appreciating those big libraries of rabbinic books and Jewish tomes. So they sold them off at a pittance to the Moicher Sfarim, right? So the Moicher Sfarim would take the books and would throw out the wormy ones, and would find that sometimes you'd find a real jewel, and you would sell them in the second-hand bookstores. So Meir Anshin was one of these Moicher Sfarim. He would go around. For a while he had a shop. But then he gave up the shop because having a shop, you have to actually be there all day. And he was an itinerant book peddler, and he would come with exactly as described in the story, with this peckle of books on his. He described as this hunchback of a bundle on his back. And he'd show up, he'd knock on the door, and he knew that Agnon and no doubt countless others, were interested in Jewish books, and he'd lay out his wares, and the balabos would decide if he wanted to purchase anything. In 1924, when Agnon first met him when he came in the second Aliyah, Anshin arrived around 1910. Agnon arrived in 1908. And then Agnon leaves in 1912 to go to Germany, where he meets the woman who becomes his wife, where he has two children, where he meets Shokin, who becomes his patron, where his house burns down along with his library and his manuscripts, and he returns in the fall of 1924. And in a letter early on, after his arrival in Jerusalem, he writes to Shokin, I've returned to Jerusalem, and I found all types of acquaintances from the good old days, meaning from when I first lived in the land of Israel between 1908 and 1912. I'll just do a free translation of what's written in the letter. Some of these people have become traders. They've become bourganim. They've become bourgeois. In the days of the second Aliyah, there were no bourgeois people. We were lucky if we could muster a cup of hot tea. Petit bourgeois, bourganim ketanim, umehem nisharu im idealehem. But yet some people managed to hold on to their ideals. I've also found an old person I knew, one of the Breslov Chassidim. He's the one who set my book V'haya Kov L'Mishor in type. Now, again, I mentioned last week that my mother told me never to make presumptions about a lady's age. But I'll assume that there's some people here that understand what it means to set a book in type. In the old days, when you printed a book, there were drawers full of the lead letters, and you would take tweezers, the typesetter would take the tweezers and would set the, you know what I'm talking about. Imagine having to explain this to a group of 18-year-olds. Say mimeograph is already high technology, right? So the man who set my first book, V'haya Kov L'Mishor, and the crooked shall be made straight, is now a Moicher Sfarim, a seller of books. And he comes to me from time to time, and he brings me nice books for sale. If I had enough money, hint, hint, I would be able to buy books, wonderful, great, beautiful books, both printed as well as books in manuscript, kitvei. Meaning he's telling Shokin, there's what's to be purchased here for your thing. And who's the seller of these fine books? Rav Meir Anshin, this Chosed Breslov, who was a typesetter. Now, in a very important essay on Agnon, written by Gershom Shalom. Agnon's friend Gershom Shalom, the scholar of Kabbalah, has an essay called S.Y. Agnon, the Last Hebrew Classic. I've mentioned it on many occasions. I've recommended it to you. If anyone would like, I'm happy to email you a copy of this essay. Shalom recalls, I think this is after Agnon passed away. What greater paradox could there be than the fact that the weekly of the socialist group Hapoel HaTzair, the newspaper Hapoel HaTzair, a group strongly influenced by Tolstoyan and Narodniki ideas, published in a long series of installments Agnon's first book, Vaya He'akov L'Mishor, and the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight. One of Agnon's most important works, published in 1912 in 7 installments in this Hebrew socialist newspaper here in Eretz Yisrael, Hapoel HaTzair. Then it was published in book form. Now, it's a curiosity that this book, which everyone agrees is among his most important, was not translated until the year before last. It was one of the books that we put out as "And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight." Yosef Chaim Brenner, a convinced atheist who was the first to recognize Agnon's literary genius. I mentioned to you that Brenner was the first to make this comparison in 1908 already between Agnon and Rabbi Nachman. Brenner scraped together his last shillings to publish the story in book form in 1912. Incidentally, the man who set it in print was a convinced follower of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, one of the great saints of Hasidism. It is on record that both of these men, the secular Brenner and the pious Agnon, took the greatest delight in the book, thereby anticipating, so to speak, all the latter contradictory attitudes of Agnon's admirers. For Brenner, it represented the first work of secular Hebrew literature in which tradition had become the medium of pure art, untouched by extraneous factors, such as criticism of or apologetics for Jewish society. For the typesetter, for Rav Meir Agnon, whom I have known for many years, it was a true embodiment of Hasidic lore and spirit. So this idea that this one work can sustain two such contradictory interpretations, right, was an early testament to the richness and multi-layered, multifaceted, multi-dimensional aspect of Agnon's writing. But it also is testimony to the presence and importance of this character, Meir Agnon, who becomes a character in the story in 1940 at a time when he was still alive. Agnon lives till 1960 or 61. Because he doesn't mention his name, because in 1961 he's alive. He'll live another 21 years after the story is first published. Because in the story he exists as this kind of abstract character, but we know from the extraneous material that it's clearly based on this actual historical figure. Here's Brenner. Let's go back to the story. The man's origins were as follows. He arrived in the land of Israel at the age of 30. That would be 1910, 2 years after Agnon arrived and 2 years before he sets "And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight" in type. He learned to set printer's type and was pleased to earn his own livelihood and support his wife and children. After a while, he grew weary with his work, for he was ill at ease with most of what he was asked to set in type, being either frivolous or heretical texts. You know, when you're a typesetter, well, you know, you have to. I have a friend who was. It was in the early years of creating websites. So like people would want to yeshiva here in Israel. Yeshiva would want a website, they'd make a website. A company would want it, they'd make a website. You remember before the internet? So one day his boss came to him. He's a yeshiva guy. One day his boss came to him and said, "We might have a problem. I just signed a big contract with a new client. I don't think you're going to be able to build their website." He said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you know what the most profitable niche of the internet is?" "Well, I don't want to say because they're ladies' presents, right? Pornography." So he said, I guess you're not going to be able to build the website." So the poor guy had to leave. He had to go find another job. So Rav Meir Agnon, is a similar situation. Not that they were publishing pornography, but they were publishing all types of things that were kfira and apikorsut and heresy. And so he didn't like setting those books in type. As for working in the printing houses for religious books, The work there is long and the pay is short. He took some of his books which don't cause damage by reading them and made his way through town. He bought me one such book, which even Rabbeinu, who's Rabbeinu? Rabbi Nachman, right, had praised, and offered it to me for sale. While I looked at the book, he related Divrei Torah v'sipurei ma'asiyot. He related words of Torah and tales of deeds, meaning that's the two main modes, those are the two channels of teaching within Breslov. Divrei Torah, things like the Likutei Moharan, and Sipurei Ma'asiyot, the Nachman-esque tales that are not exactly Hasidic tales in the conventional sense, in order to draw me in that I was close to his heart. On account of this, he forgot to put down his bundle. So there's Vayakov Lemishor as set in type by Rav Meir Anshin in 1912. There was, in 2012, we had here an exhibit. Well, it's already a bunch of years ago. 27 years ago. There was on the 100th anniversary of this first book publication of Agnon. It was the first story that he wrote that was published in book form. So we had a kind of operation in which we tried to collect as many copies. There aren't that many copies of the original book left. You see, it wasn't really printed in hardcover. It was kind of bound together with staple, right? So we found President Rivlin had a copy that was his father's, with a dedication written from Agnon. So they were here on display, these original editions for a short period. I took the bundle from his hands and placed it on the chair, and asked him how a frail man such as himself can carry such a heavy bundle. He smiled and said, "Earning one's livelihood is a difficult matter." Right? In other words, how would we say that in Yiddish? Schwer zu sein a Yid. It's tough to be a Jew. Right? I said to him, "Your relatives in America offer to support you in style if you go to them." He smiled and said, "My relatives are very wealthy, but they lack a feeling for Eretz Yisrael, since they imagine that it's possible to leave the land of Israel for one's livelihood." And here he laughed, as if the whole matter of earning his livelihood was a laughing matter. In other words, you have two options, right? Your back is against the wall. You have two options. He's poor. He's like a peddler. He's like one step above a. You know what a peddler is? The peddler also shows up with his pack. You know what he has in his pack? Maybe shmatas, a box. I remember when I was in YU in the 80s. There was an old peddler, a roichel, right? He was an old Hungarian Yid. This is the 80s. He must have been then. He must have been about 80 years old. And he was, I had been told, like the word on him was that he, had been through the Shoah, the worst of everything, and you saw that he carried his scars with him, and didn't look like he'd had a happy life. But he wasn't a schnorrer. He wasn't a beggar. He was a peddler, and he would come to the dormitory, or he'd set up on a table in the pizza shop, the greasy spoon across the street, and he'd spread out his cloth. And on the cloth, you could buy a safety pin. You could buy a clip for the yarmulke. You could buy a pen, right, that looked like somebody else had written something with it, right? And in other words, you'd buy a pen that had a big pen that had half the ink out, and maybe somebody's teeth marks on the cap, right? You'd pay him $1 for that pen, meaning it wasn't tzedakah. It was commerce. Right? It was a way of preserving the man's dignity. Right? That's peddler. Rav Meir Anshin is selling Sifrei Kodesh, but really he's only one step above that peddler. And so it's like a bad situation. But he laughs. His response to his sorrow is laughter, because you have two choices: you can laugh or you can cry. Which is better? Really, which is going to help you more? He added, it is said in the name of the Baal Shem Tov that the two jesters, Badchanim, mentioned in the Talmud, who were entitled in a share in the world to come, as they cheer up the depressed, were in fact only one person. The Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, Daf Kaf Beis Omid Aleph, 22a, is a story about Rav Baroka, who's hanging out in the shuk, in the marketplace, with Eliyahu Hanavi, who sometimes shows up, outside of time in stories. And Eliyahu Hanavi is pointing out to Rav Baroka all of the people, the seemingly simple folk, who are really B'nai Olam Haba. They are going to merit the world to come. And Rav Baroka is a little confused because they don't necessarily look like the holiest rollers. Like here's a guy walking around without tzitzis on, and but each of them has a story for why they appear the way they are. Among these characters who are inheritors of the world to come are these two brothers who are just badchanim, right? Like merrymakers. So merrymakers, like you might not think they're like the greatest Talmidei Chachamim or the holiest tzaddikim, right? They're the guys that go and machspiel at a wedding. So he says, why are they B'nai Olam Haba? Because they make people happy. That's a good thing to make people happy. So the Baal Shem Tov, I'm going to call him Anshin, even though in the story he has no name, but we know who it is. So Meir Anshin says, the Baal Shem Tov says about that Gemara that these two brothers who make the world happy, they're really the same person. Right? It's like split personality. Don't think that these two are two. They're two sides of the same personality. Why? He laughed at the world, and the world laughed at him. In other words, if you can laugh, then the world can laugh back at you. There's like the court jester, right? The court jester is the fool, right? But by being the fool, he causes other people to laugh. And usually, this is certainly true in Shakespeare and in all types of other cases, the fool is really the wise man, right? Because he's the one that, through his laughter, is able to say things that you can't say if you're actually the prime minister. Prime minister would say it off with his head. The fool, the jester, can say things and get away with it. And you know what that is in our world? When do we have that in the Jewish world? Purim. That's what the Purim spiel is. I remember Rabbi Yosef Blau explained this to me once when I was a young man in Yeshiva University working on the Purim spiel. In Yeshiva, so like the kind of standards of Kavod HaTorah and respect and etc. are quite high and correctly so, and you can't do things that maybe they do in other universities and criticize in the way that maybe they do. But Purim, you can do whatever you want. In other words, it's necessary. The system only works the other 363 days of the year, 364 days of the year, right? If you have one day when, in the guise of Purim, you're allowed to make that critique. The whole world. So too my relatives laugh at me that I live here while I laugh at them for living there. Meaning, who's the fool? Because I'm living here in Eretz Yisrael, but in Eretz Yisrael life is very hard. And I suffer. And I'm poor. And I have to have this job which is not the most respectable job in the world. They laugh at me. My rich relatives in America, they laugh at me. I laugh at them. Because they don't realize that it's better to live here in the land of Israel than to have riches in America. This also happens to be an autobiographical case that Anshin had relatives in America who tried to help him, tried to support him. I'll skip a paragraph. After he would sit before me, after he left, I said to myself that this man is from the congregation of the pure of heart. Now in Hebrew he calls them Barei Levav. Barei Levav is of course a play on words of Breslov. And it's Breslov or Hasidim are called Breslov because they're named after this town in central Ukraine where Rebbe Nachman lived for a period of time. But Agnon makes a play, this is Agnon's play on words. Al tikre Breslov ela barei levav, the pure of heart, which is of course reminiscent of Tehillim chapter 22, Psalm 22, right? Who can ascend the holy mountain? Who can stand in God's holy place? Naki kapayim uvar levav. The person whose hands are clean and has a pure heart. So as Agnon refers to the Breslover Hasidim as the Barei Levav, both here and elsewhere. In my youth, says the narrator, I pored over their books, and although I have been living together with them in this city for many years, I have not yet entered their house of study. Many times I wanted to go there to witness their customary daily dance following prayers. It's well known that the Breslovers, after davening, they have a nigun, they have a song, they have a dance. And the narrator says, I'd like to see that dance. And even though I've had this lifelong association with studying Breslov texts, I've never actually, even though I'm living many years in this city with them, I've never gone to see it. Now, this idea of the texts, the texts of Breslov. Oh, well, I'll skip this. This is relevant to the idea of laughing at the. Okay, I'll skip that. Rabbi Nachman says, there's this work, you have it on the sheets and on the screen, the Chaye Mohoran, the life of our master Rabbi Nachman, which is a kind of biography of the wonder tales and other facts of the life of Rabbi Nachman that was written posthumously by his disciple Rabbi Natan. Omar ha'olam lo ta'amu oti klum adayin. Rabbi Nachman said, the world has not tasted me at all yet, meaning the world has not experienced me yet, meaning the world does not truly know the greatness of Rabbi Nachman, he says about himself. Ilu hayu shomin rak Torah achat, sh'ani omer im hanigun v'harikud shela. If they were to only hear one Torah, one teaching, what does it mean? What is a teaching? So a teaching is, that book, Likutei Moharan or the Sipur Masiot or whatever the collection. But in other words, the teaching is not just the word black on white on the page. With the word goes the nigun, the tune, the melody. And with the melody goes the rikud, the dance. As Rabbi Nachman says, you don't just teach the Torah, you sing the Torah. And you don't just sing the Torah, you dance the Torah. And if you hear the Torah with the song and the dance, so then you'd really get it. Hayu kulam b'telim bevitul gamur. They'd be gone, right? It would be the end. Hainu kol ha'olam kulo afilu chayot v'asavim. Everything. The birds and the trees and the animals and the grass. V'chol ma sheyesh ba'olam. Hakol hayu mitbatlim b'chlot hanefesh migodel otzem ha'ta'anug ha'mufla. The whole wide world, if I would teach the Torah with a song and a dance, not just the words, not just the concepts, but if I could dance the Torah that's inside of me, the world would be batel. It would be erased. It would be erased not from destruction, but from joy, from pleasure, from ta'anug, hamuflag, ma'od ma'od, the very great, exceedingly wonderful joy, pleasure, enjoyment of the Torah. So in other words, I have my Torah, but I'm dribbling it out. I don't give it full. If I were to break forth, it would overwhelm the world. This idea of the dance, right? And what dance is, what it means to have rikud in Breslov. Rikud is not just these guys. You think of a Breslover dance, you think of those guys in the intersection bouncing up and down, right? No, the dance is the Torah. Right? The contemporary iteration of Breslov, it's more dance and less Torah. And Rabbi Nachman says, no. Like lahavdil, like the Sefer Torah, the Bible, right? There's the black words, like we say, it's black fire on white fire, and then there's the trup, the ta'amim. And when you read the Torah, you don't just read the Torah, like you read a book. There's the cancellation marks, what we call laning. Like when you get up to lane on Shabbos morning, right? There's a trup. There's a way to do it. So it's even like the dance is like a form. The dance is like a form of Tamei Mikra of the Breslov Torah. That's what Rabbi Nachman said. That's what I said. I'm saying that as a kind of analogy, a metaphor to try to understand what he's saying. Right? If we could dance the Torah, so then it would really burst forth. I lifted myself from my chair and began pacing about the room, staring at the walls and ceiling and windows, and out to the view as if something was missing. Ki'ilu chaser sham davar. I'm pacing around my room. In other words, Rav Meir, my Breslover Svarim seller shows up, and I start thinking about Breslov. I start thinking about that dance that I'd like to see. And then there's a restlessness. And I start pacing around. And I realize there's something missing. Chaser sham davar. There's something missing. And now we have the mission. All of the stories in the Sefer HaMaasim have this mission. Usually it's a very simple everyday task. The man has to get himself a meal. The man has to mail a letter. You have to catch the last bus. You have to go down to the office and have a document stamped. Right? All the kinds of tasks of modern life. But something gets in the way. They are all stories of the inability to achieve your mission. Mission impossible. Right? 2 weeks ago, I described Freud's dream of running in place and not being able to get to where you're going. That sense of anxiety, right? That's the mark of the modern, right? That's why people thought that Agnon was Kafkaesque, because that exists in Kafka. But Kafka didn't invent anxiety, right? And the fact that we call that genre of story Kafkaesque is just because Kafka kind of brought it to a level of perfection, was able to put his name on it. But we could call it Nachmanesque, and do no damage to it, because it's already present there. It's already here in Agnon. Something's missing. Now, all these people there were these people here last week who afterwards I discovered their kids have gone Breslov. I mean, I mentioned that, we have these friends in Efrat, the real straight arrows, and their kids went Breslov. They're good kids, but they went, So this other family also. So if we were to do research on these kids that go full Breslov, so what are they going to tell us? They're going to tell us something was missing. Chaser sham davar, right? In my kind of staid, middle of the road, contemporary religious Zionist, modern Orthodox existence, chaser sham davar. They're looking for something. Right? They go to Uman. They're looking for something in Uman. So he's looking around. He goes and he takes out his Shabbos clothing. It's a weekday, but he takes out his Shabbos clothing. His wife says, "Where are you going?" So he says, "Well, I want to go someplace. Maybe you want to come with me." And then they see the kids. They say to the kids, "Maybe you want to come with us too." So they go out. They go out for this walk. Here at the top of page 180. I didn't ask myself how I would get to the prayer house of the men of the congregation of Barei Levav, of the pure heart, or how I would find the way, as I had never been there in my life. That he's setting out on a journey, but what's the problem? He doesn't know where it is. It was unlikely, and this is the surrealistic aspect of it. You set out on a journey and you don't know where you're going. Right? I mean, think of all the great quest stories. This, by the way, is present in so many Rebbe Nachman stories. Right? But it's present in all great tales, right? I mean, think of Dorothy coming out of black and white Kansas into Technicolor Oz. She's on this journey, follow the yellow brick road, but she doesn't know exactly where she's going, what she has to do, or what she's going to encounter along the way. Well, part of that's just good storytelling, right? If I knew I had to do A, B, and C, so there's not too much drama. This is also reminiscent of something that Rabbi Nachman himself endured. This is Chai Moharan 129. Rabbi Nachman came to Eretz Yisrael in 1798-99, for this short, aborted trip or aliyah, it's hard to say. But before he went to Eretz Yisrael, he went to Kamenetz. The Kamenetz is this town. Everything is all more or less the same area. It's not far from Breslov. It's not far from. We were there last summer, right? It's that place with that like Sleeping Beauty palace, castle. He goes to Kamenetz. Kimivua kvar b'sefer nitpas. Uv'siato lekamenetz amar Rabbi Shimon. He said to one of his chassidim, "Yesh lefanai nesi'ah ve'eini yodei lahechan." There's a journey before me, and I don't know to where. V'sachak Rabbi Shimon. Hech nosim im ein yodim lahechan nosim. How can you journey if you don't know where you're journeying to? Ve'heshiv lo be'emet eini yodei. And Rabbi Nachman said, "Truly, I do not know." V'halach Rabbi Shimon v'hechin agala v'susim v'chol tzarchei hanesiya v'nasaimo. So he hitched up a wagon, and he goes, this is an idea, the journey without a destination. His chassid, his loyal disciple, Rabbi Shimon, knows that Rabbi Nachman has to go someplace. So what do? You hitch up the wagon. Where do you have to go? I don't know, but it doesn't matter. This is an idea you have already in the stories of the Baal Shem Tov. Right? Baal Shem Tov would wake up in the morning, say to his wagoneer, hitch the horses. There's work to be done. There's a miracle to be enacted. There are Jews to be saved. And the wagoneer would say, where to, Rebbe? And Baal Shem Tov would say, She'erutzu asusim, let the horses run. Right? Wherever the horses will run, the horses will know where to take us. So you could say that the horses that even the Baal Shem Tov's horses were miracle horses. The Baal Shem Tov's horses were Nevi'im, they were prophets. God would direct their hooves to the place where the pogrom had to be averted, or where the widow had to be rescued from oppression, or the orphans needed to be clothed, or the sick needed to be healed. The work of the Baal Shem Tov. Or you could say in that time and place, it didn't matter. She'erutzu asusim, let the horses run. Well, wherever the horses are going to go to, whichever shtetl they'd show up in, there was probably a need for a miracle there as well. There was probably somebody being oppressed that needed help. There was probably a Jew with a broken heart that needed to be comforted. I mean, that was the nature of the thing. Wherever you, right, as they say, you can't slug kaparas without hitting somebody that needs help, right? So that's the idea of the journeyless journey. Wherever you're going to go, wherever you go, that's where you are. But that idea is here. The narrator leaves the house looking for the Breslov shtibel, but he doesn't know where to go. It was unlikely anyone I might ask would know the way, since the Breslovers were kind of humble but also oppressed. In fact, the place that he gets to, the actual Breslover shtibel, had a long history of the Breslovers trying to find and establish a prayer house for themselves and being cut off at every turn. They were a poor sect of Hasidim. They didn't have resources until one particular person came and put up the money, and they didn't have a place of their own. And then even when they had a place of their own, as we'll see, it didn't all work out. So they walked. He tells his wife and children a bit about the Breslover Hasidim, about the pure of heart and the modesty that they have. And since I saw my wife and children were listening to my words, I went and told them of that tzaddik, meaning Rabbi Nachman, who passed from this world over 100 years ago. Rabbi Nachman died in 1810. This story had to take place sometime after 1937. Because the Beit Knesset that they're going to was only built in 1937, so it's even more than 100 years ago. But that tzaddik who passed from this world over 100 years ago, but whose flame will burn until the arrival of the Messiah. Now this is the Breslover motto, right? Here's the Breslover logo. Ha'esh sheli tukad ad biat HaMashiach. This is taken from Chayei Moharan. Rabbi Nachman said that my flame will burn forever and never be extinguished. If I get this wrong, you'll forgive me. Mein Ferl wird schoin tlun bis Mashiach wird kommen. Right? Ha'esh sheli tukad ad biat HaMashiach. My flame will burn until the arrival of the Messiah. So it's very clear, obviously, that we are talking about Breslov. The house, interestingly, if you look at the original edition of the story, as it appears, what you have in front of you is a translation of the story as it appears in the final edition of Agnon's book. But I've mentioned many times, Agnon was an inveterate reviser. He would write longhand, his wife would type it up. He would edit the TypeScript. The TypeScript would be typeset. They'd send the galleys. He would refine, polish, revise. It would appear in the newspaper. He would take the newspaper and cut, and when cutting and pasting was done with scissors and glue, not with buttons on a computer, he would cut the story out of the newspaper and paste it onto a large sheet of paper, and then in the margins would already start revising it for when it would appear collected in book form. The book would come out, he would start revising it for when the second edition would come out. There's some stories, we have 7 and 8 and 10 and 12 different layers of the text. The revisions that took place between the appearance of the story in 1940 in the newspaper and then its appearance in book form are minor. They're small little stylistic polishings. There's one significant change. There's a sentence that appears in the 1940 edition, which was removed from the edition that we are reading. In the 1940 edition, you have this paragraph that we just read. The paragraph that begins, "Since I saw that my wife and children were listening to my words, I went and told them of the tzaddik whose flame will burn until the coming of the Messiah." And then you have this sentence. "Tmeheti al atzmi sheniftach pi ledaber dvarim shelo yadati she'ani yoda." I was amazed at myself that I opened my mouth and I was saying things that I myself did not know. Meaning they're walking and he's teaching them and he's explaining to them what Breslov Chassidus is. And he's teaching them this central Torah of Rabbi Nachman. Eish sheli tukad ad biat HaMashiach, my flame will burn until the Messiah will come. He says, I'm amazed that I'm saying these things. How do I say something that I didn't know this before it came out of my mouth? What does that sound like? To say something, to have something come out of your mouth that you didn't know was inside of you before. A dibuk or prophecy, nevuah. Well, I don't know if he yeah, in other words, certainly he's like buying into it. In other words, in fact, autobiographically, to step outside of the story, Agnon himself was not a chassid, although his father was chassidish. I've mentioned this before, right? But Agnon did have this affinity for Breslov. But in the original version of the story, you have this line of him, like, he says, "Well, how I'm saying over all this Breslov Torah, I don't know where it's coming from." Right? Hosafti misiparti ad shenimtzanu omdim etzel beit tfilatam. Right? And I kept going on and teaching and relating until, boom, we're there. Right? The house lands, the tornado stops, the house lands, and we're in Oz. Right? I walk into the wardrobe, we come out in Narnia. Or in Agnonian terms, the fable of the goat, I held on to the end, held on to the cord, the goat led me through the cave, and I magically am transported from Poland to Eretz Yisrael. Right? In other words, how is the narrator and his children and wife transported from this house to the synagogue of the Breslovers, which happens to be in Sharei Chesed? What's the magic carpet, or the platform 9 3/4, or the magic cadence? And all of these stories, and all these fantastic stories, often children's stories, there are these passages that get you to magical worlds, right? In other words, Alice falls down the rabbit hole and gets to Wonderland, right? Dorothy gets transported to Oz through the tornado, right? The children in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's this magic portal in the back of the closet that gets them into Narnia. Harry Potter goes through platform 9 3/4 in an otherwise plain London train station and gets to gets to Hogwarts. That there is this idea that exists in children's literature, these portals that exist, that if only we knew where they were, we can get to someplace magic. So here it's not physical space. He's walking from one neighborhood in Yerushalayim to another neighborhood in Yerushalayim, but that other neighborhood in Yerushalayim might have been Neverland because he didn't know how to get there, right? So how do you get there? What's the magic spell that transports you? The Torah of Rabbi Nachman. Now, in the original edition, it's made much more explicit. Right? There's a kind of like magic spell. In this regard, the original, he softens it for the edition that we've read. But in the original edition, it's much more surreal. He's walking, and all of a sudden, coming out of him, pouring out of him, is this Torah of Breslov that he doesn't know. How could he possibly be saying things that he doesn't know? Right? It's mystical, but it's also the thing that transports them. And poof, pitom, he's been able to navigate, right, as if the Torah itself were a compass that led him on the way to get to his destination. Right? How could the Torah be a compass? Well, after all, Torah is choreograph. What's choreography? Choreography tells you the exact right motions that your body in dance, the exact. I'm not such a dancer myself, so you'll forgive me, right? But choreography, maps out for you, just like the trump, right? As every one of us, I can hand out a text. And without Trupp, without Tamei Mikra, I would tell each of us to read it, and each of us would read it in our own way. We would put intonations here, you would put intonations there. You would read this as a satirical question mark. I would read it as a serious question mark, right? Everybody would give their. But what does the Tamei Mikra do? They kind of set the proper way to read a text. The dance is a choreography. It's the exact way. The notes and music, right? Here, the cancellation marks of Kriyat Torah. But when he says that the Torah itself needs a rikud, it means that it can be choreographed. We can. So he's learning the Torah somehow is pouring out of him, and it's also guiding him in the right direction to get mystically to where he belongs. The prayer house had two. Now, this prayer house, this is an actual place. You can go there. I have been there. I've been there many times. I davened there 3 weeks ago. It's on Rehov Hashlo in Shari Chesed. My mother-in-law lives in Wolfson. Right. So it's right in Wolfson. Right off of Karen Kayemet. It's right now. It's a curious thing. You see this little square building here? This little square building is the shul that was built in 1937. In 2010, there was a destruction order, a demolition order against it because they wanted to build this building. And it went to court, and they won. So you see what they did? They built this building on all three sides of it. In other words, it's built up on these stilts, above, behind, on all sides, around this little Breslover stibble. It's across the street. You know where the Gra is? There's the minion factory called the Gra. It's right across the street from it's a kind of curious thing that the Gra and Rabbi Nachman live across the street from each other. The Misnagid and the Chosim. So this is it's called, there, you see, there it is. It's called Beit Knesset HaVatik Ohel Esther, the Chasidei Breslov Shari Chesed, Rehov Hashlo, number 11. That's the inside. If you go there on a Friday night, get there early. It's a nice davening. It's a long davening, but it's a nice davening. There's a little Ezras Nashim over here. You can't probably see much, but you can hear. And at the end of davening, they dance. And you have to dance because you can't get out. Because in this little room, there's like 50, 60 people packed in like sardines. It's pretty hot. And it was financed by this Mordechai Buxbaum, who was one of the major figures in the Agudat Yisrael. He was a lawyer, he was a chassid, he was a wealthy man. He's the progenitor of a very well-known family, the Elon family. Professor Hashofet alone was his Menachem alone was his son-in-law. Was the son-in-law of this Buxbaum and etc. So that's the actual stibul, right? There is in Mea Sha'arim, towards the end of Rechov Mea Sha'arim, today there's the Breslov where they have the chair. That picture that we've been using, that was built later. In 1937, 1938, 39, whenever the story is taking place, right, this is the destination, Shari Chesed, where the narrator shows up. The prayer house had 2 rooms, and the door was open to the street with a low wall separating it from the other streets. Nevertheless, they all seemed alike. Weeds climbed up on the sun-baked wall with broken glass shards glittering in the sun, reflecting the sparks. The sparkling morning dew on the desert sands. My hand moved of its own accord, becoming attached and connected al kapot hamanul. Right? A pasuk from Shir Hashirim, right? A phrase that Agnon uses as the title of one of his books. I whispered to myself, Kan, here. This is the place. Meaning he's been led almost like in a dream. Here, replied my wife, covering her hair and fixing the children's caps. About 20 people were in the prayer house, both old and young, and those in between. Nevertheless, they all seemed alike, either in their threadbare clothes, crumpled hats, modest manner, or their sorrowful expression mixed with joy. Sorrow mixed with joy. That's Meir Anshin. That's Breslov. This is the joy of God's servants who are near to the path of truth. Some looked into their books, others walked from room to room, their beards curling around and their sidelocks brushing their cheeks. A wordless song, Kol Lo Kol, arose from the floor and the walls of the house, like the sound of the paint the engraver puts in the letters of the gravestones, and like the sound of an old prayer shawl, an old talit, as it swallows its tears. So the song that he hears, which is not being sung by people, it's just kind of, it's like emanating, it's pouring, the song itself is coming out of the walls, out of the floor, is nigun, is palpably melancholy. The song of the painting inside the letters on a gravestone. The sound of the tears being absorbed into a talus. Right? This is not joy. This is not mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. Right? You know what? You think of a Breslov song. What do you think of? Right? You know, we could do a survey. Like, stop the next 3 people you see on the street, say, sing me a Breslov song. You know what they're going to sing? That's the Breslov Nigun. Is the teaching of Rabbi Nachman? I see it's a crowd that's not going to do Shira B'Tzibur. And that's a Breslov Nigun, right? That's what we think of as Breslov Nigun. It's a great mitzvah to always be joyful. But the song that he hears, he shows up in the shul, it's the song of the engraving, it's the sound of the engraving of a tombstone. And it's a song that's just kind of like seeping out of the walls. But this idea of the song, Rabbi Nachman, of course, very famously talks about Da Ki Kol Ro'eh V'Ro'eh Yesh Lo Nigun Miyuchad. Right, this is famously put to music by Nomi Shemer and by others. Right, every shepherd, and of course, who's Rabbi Nachman? He's a shepherd. What does it mean to be a Rebbe? It means to be a shepherd. Every shepherd has his own nigun, right? And the nigun is connected to every blade of grass. And then elsewhere he says, Da she'al yedei hanigun shel hatzadik, the nigun, the song of the righteous, of the Rebbe, Shu Bechinat Moshe, Hu Ma'aleh et HaNeshamot Min HaApikorsiyut. Right? With my nigun, I can redeem people from heresy. Again, remember Rabbi Nachman looks at the world and he sees heresy, which he interprets as madness. And he knows that his song can rescue them. But his song is not just a melody. His song is the Torah properly taught, the Torah properly danced. Every form of wisdom has its own, and there's a corresponding song, like in heaven somewhere. And if we know the song, that is the wisdom. So here's a song, but it's not a joyful song. It's a melancholy song. I held my breath and indicated to my wife and children that they should open their ears and listen. They raised their eyes until they too could see on their own with no intermediary at all. And here, the final page of the story. At that point, they had already finished their prayers. And were they to dance following prayer, they would need to gather together as one and dance. In other words, why had I come? I came because I wanted to see the dance. Because the dance itself is the Torah. And what am I looking for? I'm looking for something shechaserli, something that I'm missing. I feel this lack. And I thought I would find it if I saw the dance. But instead, they're all just standing around. And he's afraid that it won't happen. He's afraid they'll miss it. I too stood alone. Erev Tisha B'Av im Chashecha. Like the afternoon before Tisha B'Av. Right? In other words, I'm looking for joy. I'm looking for happy. I'm looking for mitzvah gedol liel b'simcha tamid. And I feel like Tisha B'Av. I suppressed all my thoughts and struggled to not think of anything at all. Suddenly a wordless song was heard. A wordless song is a nigun. A wordless song was heard like the sound of 1 hour meeting next hour before passing from this world. I don't know what that means, but it's such an evocative image, isn't it? Like 1 hour meeting, like the clock. I hear a song like the sand slipping through the hourglass. I looked up and saw the man who had visited me that day. I see Rav Meir Anshin, that sweet man. And looking out at the people, that smile which had radiated from his face had been removed. His fists clenched in fear, and he was speaking to himself with a voice that swallowed the words, and words swallowing his voice. I listened and I heard, and here are the words of the song. The world, her smoke is the desert, where the sun obliterates the shadows. That is not mitzvah gadol liel b'simcha tamid. I don't know exactly what it means, but it's despair, it's desolation, it's suffering, it's someone parched and dry and thirsty in the desert with nowhere to hide, the sun beating down on you. I don't know if the rhymes were the main thing, or perhaps arose as part of his tune, like smoke rising from fire, making shapes in the sky, or like the desert which extends from settled towns where the sun beats down and no shade in them. My two hands clenched and began to tremble, as if they too were caught by some fear, by the same fear. It seems my wife and children did the same. Because I came because I wanted to dance, I came because I wanted the simcha, and instead I get anxiety. And I'm standing there with my fists clenched and I'm shaking and I'm trembling. I looked to see if that was the case. Suddenly, they disappeared. My wife and children disappeared. Poof! That's surrealistic, because people don't actually really disappear. Doesn't mean they walked out. Right? It means they poof. Perhaps they were never there to begin with. I don't know. In other words, maybe it's just his wife and children, maybe it's all of the people, but what happens next? Only a sweet smile hovered in the air, like a dream one sees and presumes others see as well. The Cheshire Cat, right? All that's left is the smile of, I presume, of Meir Anshin. Meir Anshin who says, I'm like the Badchan. Right? In other words, okay, so they laugh at me. They see I'm a suffering fool. But if they laugh at me, then I have a place in the world to come, because laughter is a good medicine. Laughter is the only remedy for suffering. What? Oh, I mean, I guess you could read the idea that if the shadows disappear in the desert, you see the truth. But if you're in the desert and the sun is beating down on you and there's no oasis in sight, the absence of the clouds, the absence of the shadow is a pretty bad thing, I think. So this idea of mitzvah gadol liot b'simchat tamid is not borne out in this depiction of Breslov. I mean, the statement itself, mitzvah gadol liot b'simchat tamid, which is in the Likutei Moharan, Rabbi Nachman did say it, is truly an ironic statement, because it's said by someone who suffers from, if Arthur Green is right, manic depression, and if we can't properly diagnose him, then certainly someone who suffered terrible depression throughout his life. Rabbi Nachman himself suffered terribly. Rabbi Nachman buried 4 of his own children in his lifetime. He buries his first wife, and then spends the last 3 years of his short life dying of tuberculosis before he dies at the age of 38, which seems pretty young even to me. So Rabbi Nachman knows a little something about suffering. The person who says mitzvah gadol liot b'simchat tamid knows the opposite of simcha. Whoa. The point is that for Breslov, and this is misunderstood by people who only know Breslov through seeing it in the street corners, for Breslov, the idea of simcha is a simcha that emanates out of a world of suffering, out of a world of sorrow. He describes Meir Anshin exactly in these terms. It's a joy that comes out of the sorrow. Right? The sorrowful one is the one who knows what joy is. And simcha in Breslov is an attempt to transcend sorrow. Therefore, he comes looking for a joyful dance, right? That what he's looking for, he doesn't achieve. He's looking for a joyful dance. What does he find? He finds the atmosphere of Erev Tisha B'Av. Now, this is an idea that's described at some length in Likutei Moharan, the second volume of Likutei Moharan, chapter 119. You have it on the sheets, and we can read it in English to save some time. Rabbi Nachman, it's this long quote on the first page. Rabbi Nachman spoke with us a number of times about the pain of this world. Olam Hazeh. There's Olam Hazeh, this world, the world we occupy currently, and there's Olam Haba, which is a world which we hope we will be redeemed from our suffering. That absolutely everyone in the world is plagued by suffering. There's not a one who has Olam Hazeh. What's the problem with Olam Hazeh? You don't even have Olam Hazeh. What's it? Olam Hazeh is? It's food and it's drink and it's the body and the pleasures of the body, and right? It's Gashmias. You know about Gashmias? So we don't even have Gashmias. Because why? Because you know what else we have in this world? We have suffering. And suffering, damn it always gets in the way. It always gets in the way of enjoyment. Sorrow gets in the way. So that even the people that only have Olam Hazeh, they don't even have Olam Hazeh. Even the wealthy and the privileged have no Olam Hazeh at all, because all their days are frustration and grief. They are all full of troubles, worries, misery, sadness, aggravation, always, each with his particular woes. And so, of all the rich and privileged, there is not one for whom everything is always in order as he would have it. They are all as one constantly full of suffering and worry. This is clear and known to anyone who is somewhat familiar with them and their ways. And then I'll skip towards the bottom, about 7, 8, 9 lines from the bottom. In other words, since every person is born to toil and it cannot possibly be avoided, even if he owns all the riches in the world, he will certainly experience much toil, suffering, and worries. And so a wise man has a chacham einav barosho, a wise man has eyes ahead of him. He turns the toil into the toil of Torah, which is the reason he was born, to toil in Torah. So if you can, how do you escape it? The only way out is through, right? You want to escape toil? You know what the antidote for toil is? Toil. But toil in Torah. And in Torah, there you can find joy. Fortunate is he because he has spared the toil of this world and merits life in the world to come, etc., etc. And then you can say, then truly there is no Olam Hazeh, because you can transcend it to Olam Haba. But the antidote to sorrow is not bouncing up and down. The sorrow is to embrace the sorrow and to go through. This idea is reflected in other texts in Agnon. In Agnon's Tehillah, perhaps his most best-loved story. Perhaps it's time. Who's read Tehillah? Right? Perhaps it's time to teach Tehillah again because it's been a while. Agnon said about Tehillah in a record of conversations that Agnon had with the journalist David Knani. Tehillah is a story of a woman. She's 104 years old, when the narrator meets her in 1924 in the old city of Jerusalem. It's a story that was published in 1950 about the world of the Iratika, meaning it's an elegy for the old city of Jerusalem, written right after 1948, after the old city is blocked off from us. And this character, this old woman Tehillah, this righteous old woman Tehillah, is the very embodiment of the old city. And she suffers terribly. She has a very difficult life, but yet she somehow manages to maintain her dignity. She somehow manages to maintain at least the veneer of a positive outlook on life. And there were so many people who thought they knew Tehillah. In other words, they would say to Agnon, "Oh, I knew the woman that you..." Right? In other words, they thought that she had to have been a real character. People so identified with this character. So Agnon says, he says, everybody who thinks they know Tehillah they don't know what they're talking about. He says, I mean, and who knows if he was tongue-in-cheek here. He's not meant to be taken literally. He says, I met Tehillah 30 years ago in the old city on Shavuos. I went to see the Breslovers. I was on my way to the Breslov Hasidim in the old city. And there, an old Jewish woman, stood outside and asked me, "Und zu mir kommt nicht rein?" What, you're not going to come in and see me too? And as he says, there was an actual woman that I met in the old city who served as something of a model. And it's significant that he meets her amongst the Breslov Hasidim. There's a certain Breslov element within this story, Tehillah, which if we study Tehillah together, we can explore that more. But let me just tell you this one thing that Tehillah says, and with this we'll close. The narrator, who again we're meant to imagine it's Agnon himself, shortly after he returns to Eretz Yisrael, he meets Tehillah, this righteous old woman in the old city, and they're walking through the old city, the alleyways of the old city. From alley to alley, from courtyard to courtyard, we made our way down, and at each step she took, she would pause to give a sweet to a child, or a coin to a beggar, or to ask the health of a man's wife, or if it were a woman, the health of her husband. I said, since you're concerned with everyone's welfare, let me ask about yours. She answered, Baruch Hashem, for I lack nothing at his hand. The Holy One has given to each of his creatures according to its need, and I too am one of these. But today I have special cause for thanking him, for he has doubled my portion. Last week we spoke about people who say the Tehillim. So Tehillah, she's called Tehillah, and she is a reciter of Tehillim. Every day she recites a portion of the Tehillim. But this day that he encounters her, she had a double portion. She was like, the Spirit was on her, and she was saying the Tehillim, and she said extra. How is this? So she replied, each day I recite the Psalms. Today I recite the Psalms for 2 days. Even as she spoke, her face clouded over with grief. Her face clouds over with grief. And he says, your joy has passed away, I said. She's smiling. But then when she recalls that she had said a double amount of Tehillim, so she suddenly looks sad. So she's silent for a moment. Then she said, yes, my son, I was joyful, and now it is not so. Yet even as she spoke, the light shone out again from her face. She's joyful, then she's sorrowful, and then she resorts to joy. She raised her eyes and said, "Blessed be he who has turned away my sorrow." Why, I asked, were you joyful, yet afterwards sad, and now joyful again? She said very gently, "Your words are not chosen with care. I must tell you this was not the right way to ask." But he said, "Why were you joyful? And then you were sad, and then you were joyful again." So she said, "Fakert, you got it all wrong. You should have said, 'How have you deserved that God should turn away your sorrow? For in his blessed eyes all is one, whether sorrow or joy.'" In other words, she says, you misunderstand. At this point in the story, neither the narrator nor we, the reader, fully understand the extent of the suffering that she has undergone, and she has suffered greatly. And we discover that as the story unfolds. But she appears, there are people like this. There are people who they're just natural. Their state of nature is natural joy. And everybody has moments where they're unhappy. And then there are other people whose state of nature is kvetch. Even though maybe at their grandson's wedding they're happy. It's a question of what's your default position. So she always presents herself as a very positive person. But at one moment, he says something and a shadow passes over her. And he says, "Well, why did you come sad?" So she says, "You have it all wrong." The question is, how am I able to always appear happy? In other words, you misjudge. I succeed in presenting a happy face most of the time. But don't think that that's the state of nature. Don't think that's the default. The default is I am someone who has suffered terribly. My default is sorrow. But yet I manage to experience joy. Not just that not that I manage to put on a fake show. I manage to achieve joy. But it is an achievement. It has to be worked at. Right? Momentarily, momentarily you were able to peek at me in my state of nature. But don't mistake the situation. We live in a world where there's sorrow, and we must struggle. We must fight the Sisyphean battle of rolling that rock uphill to achieve happiness. You think you're going to show up at shul one day because they sing and dance and you're going to find the thing that's missing in your life? No, it's not that simple. There's no magic solution. You have to work at it. You want to be joyful like Rav Meir Anshin? Then you have to be a Jew like Rav Meir Anshin. You have to work at it. You have to be aware. There's no magic pill. There's no drug. It's in some way, and I don't mean this as a criticism of anybody's service of God, but it's the exact opposite of what appears to be the contemporary iteration of Breslov. Right? That's the point. In the stories of the Sefer HaMaasim, the narrator never achieves his end. Almost all of the stories end in ambiguity. Right? He's left hanging. In one story, he's quite literally on a bridge to nowhere, trying to get to his destination, and there's no way forward. Right? You're kind of caught. That's the condition of modernity. In that way, the stories are Kafkaesque. Right? That you're just left hanging, sometimes literally hanging. Right? That's the condition of modernity. That's what Agnon is trying to depict in his modernistic stories. That the anxiety, the being at the crossroad, the being caught between faith and doubt and tradition and modernity and the apikorsut, the heresy that Rabbi Nachman was so concerned with, between madness and sanity. What is the Cheshire Cat? When the Cheshire Cat is left there just with the smile, what's the Cheshire Cat's kind of trademark line? Is it something like, "Are we all mad here?" Right? Who remembers Alice? I'm pretty sure it's something like that. Right? So the Cheshire Cat is left. The Cheshire Cat disappears. All that's left is that grin. Now, the Cheshire Cat's grin is a kind of demonic one. Mayor Anshin's grin is a sweet one. Right? But that idea that there is madness in the world, that we must struggle to maintain our sanity. That's the message. Maybe I'll just end with the other classic story of madness in Rebbe Nachman. Also about a king. This is the story that follows the story of the rooster prince, the turkey prince. The wise man comes to the king and says, there's something wrong with all of the wheat, all of the produce in the kingdom. If you eat it, you'll go insane. But it's the only food that the kingdom has to eat. So the king says to the wise men, perhaps you and I should not eat it, so that we will not go insane. So the wise man says to him, no. In a kingdom of madmen, if we're the only ones that are sane, we'll be the madmen. It'll be a topsy-turvy world. But what we should do is we should make a mark on our foreheads. This, in some cases, this has been interpreted as tefillin. Right? We should make a mark on our foreheads so that when I see you and you see me, we'll remember that we're insane. It's one thing to be insane. It's another thing to not even know you're insane. Rabbi Nachman says the world we live in is insane. It's insane because people are leaving tradition. Right? It's insane because people are embracing heresy. But they think that is sanity. So we must remember that sorrow, insanity, heresy, these are things to be worked against. Right? And we shouldn't forget that we have to work against them. Because once you forget that you're insane, then you have no chance. These are some of the themes that come out of Rabbi Nachman that reverberate in what Agnon is saying. Of course, Agnon was not a Hasidic Rebbe, right? Agnon's first impulse was not to teach Torah, but to be an artist, right? To create something of aesthetic value, piece of literature. But he understood that these themes that had been first put forth by Rebbe Nachman 100 and 120 and 130 years earlier, right? Had maybe even more powerful resonance in the first half of the 20th century. This story is published in 1940. Right? 1940. Imagine how it might have been written just a year or two or five after, when what it means that the world is going insane would take on even greater meaning after the Shoah. So I thank you all for your endurance and for participating in the series. And thank you to the folks online. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list to find out about future activities, please sign up here. For those of you here in Jerusalem, unfortunately, these won't be broadcast on Thursday, July 11th at 7 o'clock here. I'll be giving a talk in English about the connection between Agnon and Amos Oz. And on the 18th at the Khan Theater, there's a showing of the play based on Agnon's Tehillah, the story I just mentioned. It's a fabulous play. I've seen it 3 times. It's in Hebrew with English subtitles. And on Thursday night, I'll be giving a talk in English a half hour before the play. And then there's also a showing on Saturday night, but it's for friends of Beit Agnon, there's a very special discount, 85 shekel instead of 220 shekel. And if you didn't get that email, so I will send you the link. I will stay online if anybody has any questions or people in the audience, and thank you everybody. This is the final session.